So we covered depressive and masochistic structure. Depressive we covered in the last in-person class period. I started talking about masochism in that class period, and then I am in the process right now actually of uploading the video of the conclusion of the lecture on masochism. We're going to talk also about obsessive compulsive personality structure and paranoid personality structure, and I will upload this video, and that will conclude the material for this semester. So these are going to be the last two personality structures that we'll talk about. They are not, as I said before, in the last in-person class. There are other personality structures. What we're going over are the most common ones. We have to omit some of them. We don't have time to go over every single possible structure. So, obsessive compulsive personality. Okay, so we'll start with a distinction. We want to make a distinction between obsessions which are about thinking and compulsions which are about behavior. So technically, there's no such thing as obsessive behavior, and technically, there's no such thing as compulsive thinking. If it's about thinking, we talk about it in terms of obsession, and compulsions inevitably are describing behaviors. So with that as a starting point, one of the things that's striking about obsessive compulsive personality structure is just how prominent it is in our world today, and that is in no small part because we have grown as a culture and arguably as a planet, as a world, to value reason, disciplined thinking, and productivity. And I think it would be a reasonable thing to hypothesize that this is probably at least partly the result of capitalism. The advantage of capitalism, of course, is that pretty indisputably it promulgates comfort. Any culture in which capitalism takes hold, life tends to become more comfortable. It tends to become wealthier. As capitalism is spread across the globe, poverty has diminished. And I'm not saying that's the only cause, but it appears to be a variable. The other thing that's an asset about capitalism is that it puts, to a greater degree than any other economic system, it puts responsibility for the individual in the hands of the individual. So that's a good thing in the sense that, okay, now I feel like I'm in control of my life. It's a bad thing in the sense that, okay, well, you're in control of your life, kind of that existential thing, right? You know, if you don't chase and achieve, you're going to be uncomfortable. And while in our modern culture we do have mechanisms to catch people who for whatever reason aren't flourishing in the capitalist model, welfare systems and that sort of thing, there is a fair amount of pressure. There's a cost to it, right? So there's reasons why this economic model is spread throughout the globe, and one of the, I guess you could call it a cost of it, is that it tends to foster this obsessive and compulsive way of functioning, right? In order to succeed, in order to assume responsibility for yourself and flourish, you need to be able to think carefully and clearly, and you need to be in control of your behavior. So, as capitalism has spread across the globe, as it has affected more and more societies, what we're seeing kind of a rise in this way of functioning, frankly, certainly in Western cultures and arguably across the globe. And what we're talking about here is a personality structure in which thinking and doing are disproportionately valued over, frankly, the kind of the animal aspects of ourselves, right? The emotional, the messy, the unproductive, the inactive. So active, controlled, reasonable thinking and behaving is valued in excess of infantile qualities. At the healthy end of the spectrum, at the kind of high neurotic end of the spectrum, obsessive compulsive personalities tend to be fairly excessive tend to be fairly successful. Not surprisingly, right? Because the structure of the personality is kind of built around discipline and care and conscientious application of effort and these kinds of things. And so you tend, if you look in the professions and you look in medicine and you look in the law, accounting, you look at professors, you tend to see at least some degree of obsessive and or compulsiveness. People that you think of as workaholics or highly achievement focused, intense people generally have fairly pronounced obsessive and or compulsive qualities. One caveat before we get on and we start talking in some more detail is to recognize that there is actually, with the distinction between obsessions, and compulsions, the distinction between thinking and doing, we need to recognize that, and this is the reason why I keep saying obsessive and or compulsive, right? I'm doing that because not everybody who is markedly obsessive in their cognitive style is necessarily compulsive behaviorally, and not everybody who is compulsive behaviorally necessarily spends a lot of time introspecting and obsessing, right? An example of somebody who cathects, doing over thinking. Cathecting means investment. You're investing emotional or psychological energy in something, and you can cathect thinking and doing. You can have a cathexis for a person, investment of emotional energy in a person. You can cathect certain values, etc. So cathexis means you've invested psychological energy in something. Somebody like a carpenter, we would say, has cathected doing over thinking. They're methodical and careful and meticulous in their behavior, in their measuring, in their cutting, and if they don't, they're not very good carpenters, right? And there may be some degree of obsessiveness when they're thinking about what they're doing, but when you move away from that, you can very easily imagine finding a carpenter that's not spending a lot of time up in his head or her head, fretting and worrying about things and thinking, am I outside of carpentry? Am I behaving in just exactly the right way, et cetera, right? So you do have people who, and that carpenter, for example, may not really be a distinct, strong, compulsive personality. It may just be a component of who they are. But you can certainly, the point here is you can certainly cathect doing over thinking, and conversely, you can certainly cathect thinking over doing. So somebody like a philosophy professor would be somebody, believe me, I was a philosophy major when I was an undergraduate, and I remember distinctly philosophy professors who were very meticulous and careful and obsessive in their thinking style. They spent a tremendous amount of time, a tremendous amount of energy invested in what was going on internally in their own heads. And you walk into their office, and their offices were a disaster area. And I remember being struck by that because I'm both obsessive and compulsive. I have pretty strong tendencies in that way. So I tend to be very orderly the way compulsive people tend to be. And I remember being struck. It was hard to relate to at first because I had always assumed, kind of egocentrically, I had always assumed that one's in the environment that one produces reflects what's going on internally, right? So somebody who's messy on the outside must be messy on the inside, and somebody who's orderly on the outside must be orderly on the inside. That, in fact, is not true. It's also not inevitably false. Generally speaking, those two things go together. They just aren't inevitably paired, right? So these philosophy professors who might have just disastrous offices that look like a tornado had gone through them, actually, most frequently were very meticulous and careful and orderly in the way they were thinking. So obsessiveness and compulsiveness frequently go together, but are not inevitably paired in a personality. So we talk about it for that reason, because they're frequently paired with one another. You frequently find obsessiveness and compulsiveness in a single individual. But we also talk about them because even when you don't find those two things in the same individual, when you look at the backgrounds of somebody who is more obsessive than compulsive, and you look at the background of somebody who's more compulsive than obsessive, you get some common developmental underpinnings, some common developmental precipitating environment for that personality structure. So people who are mostly compulsive and people who are mostly obsessive tend to share some common developmental experiences. Okay, so speaking developmentally, what's going on? What you tend to see in the backgrounds of people who are obsessive or compulsive, or obsessive and compulsive, tends to be a fairly strong anal phase fixation. The personality tends to be structured around the issues of control, of autonomy, of shame and doubt that tend to characterize that second stage, that 1.5, 2 years old up to about 3 or 4 years old, that terrible twos broadly period of development. So you find these people focused on issues of cleanliness, orderliness, strong-willedness, stubbornness, punctuality, control. They also tend to be, people who are obsessive and compulsive tend to be a little more rigid emotionally, interpersonally. They tend to be perceived sometimes by others as selfish, and that's largely a function of the fact that they're so it's hard work being obsessive and compulsive. They put a tremendous amount of energy into controlling themselves and controlling their immediate environment and making things what they see as reasonable and orderly and predictable. That takes a lot of effort, and so sometimes that preoccupation, which tends to be about themselves and their own world, can be perceived, accurately or not, as selfishness. Now, if somebody is so focused on themselves that they neglect other things in the world and they prioritize themselves over other people, that is selfishness, arguably. Okay, so the reason that we talk about obsessive compulsive character in predominantly anal phase, autonomy, shame, and doubt terms is, and this is Nancy McWilliams' language here, toilet training usually constitutes the first situation in which the child must renounce what's natural for what's socially acceptable. The child who is being trained too early or too strictly enters a power struggle that the child is doomed to lose. The experience of being controlled, judged, and required to perform creates angry feelings and aggressive fantasies that the child eventually feels as bad. And my little box down here that has my video in it, I can't see what the next word is. Probably, no, not shameful. Anyway, bad, something dirty and shameful part of the self. So while Dr. McWilliams is talking in terms of toilet training, because that's kind of the archetypal conflict around which anal phase development is coalesced. It's I don't want to say it's metaphorical because it's not metaphorical. I mean, toilet training in a practical sense often is conflictual and invested with all sorts of tension and emotional significance for people who end up as adults with obsessive and compulsive personality structure. But it would be a mistake to think that it was just the toilet training. The reality is that the kinds of families that produce people with obsessive compulsive characteristics aren't families in which the only point of conflict and control by the parents occurs during toilet training. No, it's characteristic of the family dynamic generally. Toilet training may be the first major instance, and it may kind of lay the blueprint for what comes after, but it certainly isn't the only point of conflict. The significance of it, symbolically and practically, is that it's taking place at a time where the child is beginning to form a firm self-concept as a person, the picture of themselves, a picture of who they are and who they should be. You remember that Freud talked in terms of superego development, the do's and don'ts of who you are going to be as a person, forming shortly thereafter in the next phase, in the phallic phase. So what McWilliams is getting at here is that this is kind of the beginning of the child developing tension around the battle between who they are naturally, like animalistically, who they instinctually are, and who they must be in order to function in society and be accepted by others. And the nature of how that tension is negotiated between the parent and the child plays a role in how acceptable to the child is that animalistic aspect of who they are, that impulsive, dirty, emotional, messy animal that is kind of at the core of all of us. And if the struggle around toilet training and other issues of kind of functioning in society, functioning in civilization, are imbued with excessive efforts by the parents to control the child's behavior, a shaming of any lack of control or lack of capacity, then what you get is you get a shaping of this sense that that part of who I am is bad, dirty, shameful. As a result, because every person wants to be loved, every child wants to be loved and accepted, you get in the compulsive obsessive character, you get a compensatory kind of cathexis, compensatory investment in cleanliness, control of emotions and control of behavior, punctuality, reasonableness, unemotionalness, careful control of emotion, a rejection of that animalistic, uncivilized, infantile self. And self-esteem is determined by how well do I manage this? How well do I control this? How well do I comply with the demands of the superego, the ego ideal, and the conscience, which of course the ground for which is laid by the parents. So the core affective conflict, which is another way of saying the point of emotional tension for somebody who has obsessive compulsive character is anger at being compelled to behave in a certain way, and, on the one side, and fear of being rejected or condemned or punished, unloved, etc. on the other hand. So they're caught in this untenable situation. Do I allow myself to be controlled by others, or do I risk rejection, condemnation, aloneness? And for most people, I mean, there are people who essentially reject that conflict and become messy, poorly controlled emotionally, tend to hoard and neglect self-care in terms of bathing and that kind of thing. There are those people. They're certainly less common, and you can think of that as kind of like the shadow, so to speak, of the obsessive compulsive personality. It's the opposite of that, the opposite resolution, I guess you could say. But in most cases, the choice that is made, rage at being controlled versus a fear of being condemned, punished, abandoned, the decision for most people who end up with obsessive compulsive character is to establish, to prioritize self-control. And of course that self-control is guided by the introjection, the identification with the parent. So thinking comes to be valued over feeling. Orderliness, punctuality tends to be preferred over slovenliness, unreliability, that sort of thing. Part of thinking being prioritized over feeling, feelings being perceived as messy or shameful. With a couple of exceptions. The first of the two exceptions would be people who are obsessive and/or compulsive tend to be fairly comfortable. They tend to be justifiable. Indignant anger tends to be what we would call egosyntonic. It tends to kind of feel right for the person who is obsessive compulsive. And this, of course, is an allowable discharge of that rage at being controlled. When the experience of the anger generally for somebody who's obsessive compulsive tends to be around that aspect of the self that has been rejected. So you tend to get indignant anger and kind of a disgust toward things that are disorderly, messy, undisciplined behavior, overly emotional expression. People who are have inadequate control of their emotions tend to get this. They tend to elicit this reaction from this rejection, this emotional rejection from people who are obsessive compulsive, and that's acceptable. The person who's obsessive compulsive, who may otherwise be fairly uncomfortable with significant expressions of emotion, by and large feels pretty comfortable with this anger. The other thing, interestingly, that obsessive compulsive people tend to resonate with, tend not to be, ironically, ashamed of, uncomfortable with, is shame itself. Specifically when the person fails to meet their own standards, they're very aware of a sense of shame around that. And oftentimes aren't even particularly hesitant to acknowledge that to others. That emotional response to their own failure. So outside of that indignant anger, that justifiable anger, and a sense of shame at failing to meet their own standards, by and large, obsessive compulsive characters tend to be fairly buttoned up as far as emotion is concerned. That, of course, is more the case as you become as you see an obsessive compulsive person who is less healthy. The healthier an obsessive compulsive character is, the more capable they are of allowing themselves to experience emotion in close relationships, in unique circumstances. Somebody dies or something like that. They tend not to be real emotionally expressive people. They tend to be, again, fairly buttoned up, fairly composed most of the time. But as they appear better integrated, more insightful and healthier, that capacity to be comfortable with emotional expression tends to expand a bit. So the obsessive, this is the case for all the personalities, right? A way of thinking about each of the personalities is that the relative degree of health corresponds to a reduction in the sense of being constrained by the personality, right? The healthy narcissist recognizes the nature of their narcissism, recognizes the core inadequacy driving it. The healthy depressive recognizes the variables that are kind of driving their need to be accepted and loved by somebody, and their fear of being rejected by them. And of course, as that insight grows, the capacity to kind of function outside those constraints generally develops, not inevitably, but generally. So with obsessive compulsive character, the primary defense mechanism around which the whole thing is built is, like narcissistic personality structure, is reaction formation, in which the person allows themselves to be aware of and to kind of fully express the opposite of whatever it is that they perceive as shameful or unacceptable. In the narcissist, the reaction formation is against that core sense of inadequacy and self-loathing, and what gets expressed and generally so consciously experienced is, I am wonderful, I am fully capable, I am effective, etc., right? That narcissism. The reaction formation in somebody who is obsessive compulsive it's the same mechanism. So it's a rejection of the chaotic disorder, excessive emotionality, impulsiveness of the animal core of who we are, and an investment instead in civilized reasonableness, orderliness, punctuality, reasonable expression, reasonable and controlled expression of emotion, careful, thoughtful assessment, which can become obsessive, to the point that generally speaking, just kind of, even somebody who's very healthy on an obsessive compulsive scale, that sense of themselves as animalistic can often be relegated to the point, while they may have, at the healthy end, they may have awareness of that aspect of who they are, day-to-day functioning is kind of relegated to the background. In the less healthy obsessive compulsive, they may not even be aware of that component of who they are, and they may be disgusted by expressions of that in others. The other thing that you see with people who are obsessive compulsive is a tendency to displace particularly their anger. And this is because one of the things that we see in obsessive compulsive character is that anal phase anger and indignance at having somebody else try to compel your behavior, try to control you. Um, and so that's kind of one of those organizing themes for that anal phase theme of anger around being controlled is central to the obsessive compulsive personality. So the anger tends to get easily activated by things, especially things that touch on that tension between order and chaos. And the dynamic of that core emotional tension is a conflict with authority, right? Because originally, keep in mind, where does it start? It starts in, metaphorically and practically, toilet training, where mommy, daddy, the ultimate authority at that point, are trying to make you do something that kind of goes against your instinct, your natural state. And as a result, the groundwork is laid for a person who is obsessive compulsive being fairly sensitive to efforts by authority figures to control them and to compel them, and they tend to resist that, and they tend to experience anger. But of course, that anger, residual from early development, is being felt not inevitably, but generally most easily toward authority. And the problem is that there's a couple problems. The first one is you get in trouble if you express overtly anger toward authority, right? You get mad at your boss, you get mad at your professor, and you blow up at them, you're going to get in trouble. So one of the natural solutions for this is take that and displace it onto other things. Take the anger out, the energy associated with the anger out, and use it in different directions. So it could be displacement. In a very healthy obsessive compulsive, it might be more of a sublimation, where the anger is, instead of being let loose as anger on somebody, the energy that's associated with the anger perhaps is used to drive vigorous exercise or I don't know, something similar. There was something else I wanted to say about that, about the anger and the displacement, and I lost it. Okay, so the obsessive compulsive character broadly is characterized by reaction formation and, to a lesser degree, that tendency toward displacement. You do get some disparity between people who are predominantly obsessive and people who are predominantly compulsive in terms of the mechanisms that produce obsessiveness as opposed to compulsiveness. So sometimes you get these mechanisms all in one person, and sometimes, for example, we'll talk about thinking first, obsessiveness first. In people who have cathected thinking overdoing, people who tend to be obsessive but not particularly compulsive, you tend to see secondary to reaction formation. You tend to see the predominant defense as isolation or isolation of affect. And this is the strategy they use because they overvalue the thinking and are imbued with a sense of shame when emotion and affect takes prominence for them. It makes them feel immature, weak, inadequate, poorly, out of control, this sort of thing. So isolation of affect is a state in which one might be able to acknowledge the existence of an emotion, but you're not particularly experiencing it. Where the person will say to you, I feel sad, but they don't appear to really have the emotional experience of sadness. It's like they have intellectualized it, really. They know it's there and they can think about their sadness, but they're insulated to some degree from the actual immersion in the sadness. And so related defenses that are kind of under the rubric of isolation of affect are rationalization or explaining away, Moralization, or well, not only is this acceptable rationalization, but it's actually a good thing that I'm fill in the blank, whatever. Uh, Compartmentalization, which is, okay, I'm going to take this thing that bothers me and I'm going to put it over here and I'm not going to think about it. Intellectualization, which is I'm having a difficult experience, a difficult emotional experience, say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to go up in my head and I'm just going to spend time thinking about it rather than feeling it. So you can see how all those things are they're not denial of affect, they're not denial of emotion, but they tend to isolate the experience and confine the experience of emotion. And so you get that constellation, isolation of affect, rationalization, moralization, compartmentalization, intellectualization in people who are who have preferentially cathected thinking, people who are obsessive. And what this produces, this over-cathexis of thought and the rejection as shameful and immature of strong emotional immersion and strong emotional experience, is a discomfort and even a relative inability to be tender, to be vulnerable, to allow the expression, the acknowledgement emotionally of pain. To cry when something makes you sad. The partial upside of this is you look like you got your crap together, right? You're not emoting everywhere. You're not falling apart. Somebody says something mean to you, and you look pretty okay. You don't look particularly upset. So you function well kind of in a public sphere. You're able to continue to do what you got to do, get the job done, that sort of thing. But sometimes what people will say in relationships with people who are kind of in that middle range of obsessive compulsiveness in terms of health, right? So not the people who are the really, really healthy, people who have good insight and really kind of know what's going on internally. Instead, the people who, they function well, they're certainly not in the borderline range or worse, even in the psychotic range. They're solidly in the neurotic range, but they don't have the insight. They are kind of controlled by that obsessive and or compulsive style. People who are heavily obsessive can look great publicly if you're kind of casual acquaintance with them. They're pretty. They may be pretty impressive people. They really look like they have their crap together. But then, if you find yourself getting involved in an intimate relationship with them, sometimes what happens is you end up being left with a feeling of like, is this all there is? Like when you get to know somebody intimately, emotionally, if you become emotionally intimate with somebody, generally speaking, you feel like a little bit like the veil has been pulled back. Like you got behind the curtain. You know them, and you've seen them. They've been vulnerable with you. They've allowed you to see their pain. They've allowed you to see their uncertainty. With a person who's obsessive and relatively less insightful, they will talk to you about you being very trusted and I'm very close to you and these kind of things, but you don't feel like you don't get that sense of openness with them, in part because they may not even be aware that component of who they are is there. So they're showing you what they're aware of. And of course, as the person becomes more well integrated and healthier, and more insightful into what is driving their character, they may recognize that I have this irrational reluctance to be vulnerable, to allow somebody to see my pain, and if they're healthy, what they're doing is they're working to gradually become more comfortable with that. So obsessive, somebody who tends toward the obsessive end as opposed to the compulsive end of this character structure, isolation of affect and all the associated intellectualization, rationalization, moralization, etc. On the other hand, for the doers, the people who have cathected behavior, cathected action, the compulsives, the preferred defense is undoing. And this is, we talk about this as an action that has the unconscious meaning of atonement and or magical protection. And this is something that should be very familiar to you. All or nearly all of us have some aspect of this in our character, right? This is, I've talked in here before about middle childhood management of ambivalence toward parents being expressed in that step on the crack, break your mother's back, and we talked about how that is residual of that infantile mistaken assumption that your thoughts and your feelings were more powerful and capable of affecting the outside world in and of themselves. This is related to that. This is residual of that infantile confusion about how omnipotent we are, right? And we'll all do things. Anybody who's ever knocked on wood when they've said something, oh, the test is going to go well, knock on wood. That superstitious thing. Any sort of superstitious behavior would be in the same camp as the kind of undoing defense that is characteristic of the compulsive. And this would include in actual obsessive compulsive disorder, where a person becomes preoccupied and their life becomes dominated by their obsessions and their compulsions. In that instance, what you see often, when we think of it in the popular sense, what we think of as obsessive compulsive is the person who's ritualistically washing their hands to the point where they develop sores on their hands, or before they enter or leave a room, they got to flip the light on and off 50 times before they can leave the room or before they can come into the room. Those kinds of things. And they'll tell you generally that they don't have insight into the source of this feeling, this behavior that they feel like I've got to do this or something bad is going to happen. That's what they'll tell you. I don't feel right if I don't do this. And of course, very, very pronounced in obsessive compulsive disorder, the diagnosis of a disorder. More well integrated in the relatively healthy obsessive compulsive character, and very well integrated in somebody who's quite healthy. The compulsion in that sense has been shaped to serve them. People who are very, very healthy in this in the compulsive component of this, the very healthy person looks very disciplined and reliable, and they go about their lives behaviorally in a very orderly way, but they are capable of setting that aside and having some spontaneity. They're capable of having their routine and their ritual interrupted without becoming excessively angry and agitated. That capacity diminishes as the person becomes less insightful and less well integrated, less healthy. One of the things that is not absolutely, but nearly inevitable, I won't say that. It's very, very common for somebody who is compulsive, is that the behaviors are almost always related to guilt. And again, this ties in to that the origins of obsessive and compulsive character being in anal phase, power struggles with the parent, whose voice is later internalized as the voice of the conscience and the framework for the ego ideal. And so guilt for somebody who is obsessive compulsive can be a powerful driving factor, and is the the origin or the energy, so to speak, behind a lot of the undoing. And the classic example, I cannot tell you how many times I saw this, and I feel bad for saying it's almost a cliche, but it is almost a cliche. And not just among people who have obsessive compulsive disorder. But one of the things that I saw, I'm doing this with my hands as I'm getting ready to tell you this, when I worked in private practice, I would say probably 70% of my caseload were young males between the age of about 13 and 30. And oh my gosh, the hundreds and hundreds of times that I had an adolescent male who at one point or another went through some period of compulsive cleanliness, including hand washing, not unusual at all. And it was almost inevitably around masturbation. It was almost inevitably they were raised in families where they had one or two reasonably obsessive compulsive parents, maybe fairly psychologically healthy, but they're raised in that kind of environment where the expectations are high, and they tend to be, obsessive compulsive people tend, not inevitably, but they tend to be more likely to be religious for reasons that should be apparent in terms of there is kind of an obsessive and compulsive quality to strong religious belief, right? And so that likely will fit well for somebody who's obsessive compulsive. So the homes tend to be fairly religious homes. They tend to be, certainly if they're not religious, they're very orderly, and the expectations are very clear, expectations for controlling yourself. And you would see this emerge in these boys as they entered adolescence, and masturbation became an issue. They would develop fairly significant, they would struggle with it. They would struggle with the guilt associated with this new urge. And when that would happen, you would see the classic one would be hand washing, for obvious reasons. Almost to the point that it was a cliche. And that really is, if you want the kind of the classic example of what we're talking about here, that would be the classic example. And as I think I said this a few minutes ago, it's important to bear in mind that the compulsive behaviors have their origin in that infantile misunderstanding that one can somehow control the world around oneself by thoughts and behaviors that aren't logically connected. So the infant cries and is magically satiated by the breast or by the bottle. And early on, the child misattributes the resolution of their hunger, their satiation, to the crying itself, rather than to the actual kind of chain of events that they cried, and baby cried, and mother heard it, prepared the bottle, or came in and breastfed the child. The initial connection is the crying led to the satiation, and that mistake, that style of cognitive mistake, is that we think about that as underlying this superstitions, compulsive behaviors, this sort of thing. That is this kind of this magical thinking. One of the other things to bear in mind about obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors is that the more pronounced they are, the more intense they are, it's a reasonably reliable thing to assume that they are in response to a correspondingly intense urge. I'm continually struck by this when in the popular media somebody is discovered to have failed their ideals. You see this with discouraging frequency among people who are religious figures. the example I would give you here is Martin Luther King, and who everybody knows, and then Paul Tillich, who fewer of you may know. Paul Tillich was arguably the foremost Christian theologian of the last 100 years. Massively intellectually influential, brilliant guy. Both he and Martin Luther King struggled with sexual impulses. Both of them had multiple infidelities in their marriages. And it's often presented in the media as if, they're disingenuous, or they're false, or they're just putting on an act. In reality, generally, it's the impulse itself that is driving the compulsive pursuit of goodness, right? The man who assiduously works to be, to follow the tenets of his religion, it's the opposite of what we generally assume. The assumption looking at it from the outside is frequently that, that person is good to their core, or something resembling that. In reality, what is often the case is the people who are the most invested, immersed, they're obsessed, they're compulsive about their religious practice. Not infrequently, those people are that way because of the battle that they're fighting, because of the intensity of the urges that they're trying to resist that are inconsistent with the religious teachings that they follow. And so that is the nature of obsessive, it's reaction formation, right? That's the nature of obsessive compulsive character. So if nothing else, I hope that kind of gives you pause when you find somebody who has been busted by the media for living in a way that doesn't measure up to their ideals. Sometimes it is blocking on the term, hypocrisy. Sometimes they are just hypocrites. Other times they're not hypocrites. They're people who have long struggled with their urges, and their religiosity, their dedication, was because of the intensity of the things that they were trying. They were trying to be better than they were. That would be the way they often see it. And it tends to foster a little bit of patience and empathy when you recognize that. So people who end up with obsessive compulsive character, I think I've already spoken to a lot of these upcoming slides. We've already kind of hit on a lot of this, so these will go a little bit more quickly. People who have pronounced obsessive compulsive character tend to be raised by people who set high standards for behavior and are quite strict, fairly rigid in their parenting. That's not to say they're bad parents. They may be very fair, and they may consistently reward good behavior and consistently punish bad behavior. The measure of what kind of obsessive compulsive character is going to be fostered by the parenting lies mostly in the degree of warmth. So if you get parenting, superficially good parenting, they reward good behavior, they punish bad behavior, but there's not a lot of emotional warmth, there's not a lot of affection, there's not a lot of emotional intimacy. What you get are fairly rigidly controlled obsessive compulsives that lack insight, lack capacity for tolerating any imperfection in themselves or in others. So more neurotic in the sense of being less healthy. If, on the other hand, the upbringing is characterized by that really consistent implementation of discipline, they reward the good stuff, they punish the bad stuff, they stick to their guns, but there is genuine affection and warmth and gentleness. The classic picture I would present is, the kid misbehaves and gets punished, and the punishment is implemented rigorously, whether or not, no matter how the parent feels, no, you broke the rule, this is the consequences for breaking the rule. They implement whatever those consequences are. But then after the consequences are over, there's affection. Almost as if you're disconnecting the consequences from how I feel about you. I often tell people that when our kids were little and they would get punished, say there were a very few things when they were up until the kids were about 6. There were a few things that would warrant getting a whap on the bottom, right? Open defiance. If I were to say to one of the kids, something's sitting on the table and they walk up and start to touch it, and they're 3 or 4 years old, and I say, don't touch that, and they look at me and they go, touch it, right? That would be a whap on the butt. I told you not to do it. You looked me in the eye and you did it anyway. Come here. Whap on the butt. They weep and wail because we didn't use that generally. It was generally reserved for things that were a big deal. Tried to do it as unemotionally as possible. Whap on the butt. They would break into tears. You'd let them, okay, go over there and sit down and calm down, and give them a little bit of time to settle down and think about what they did. And then when all is said and done, you go over and you squat down next to them and you say, so do you understand why I gave you a spanking? And you gave me a spanking because I touched that. You told me not to touch it. And they start crying again. And you rub their back and you say, yeah, that's right. So next time, are you gonna disobey me when I tell you not to do something? No, I'm not going to. Okay, good. So it's okay. It's okay. Let's go do something to cheer up a little bit, because it's all done now. I'm not mad at you. You got you got in trouble, but you're okay now. And then we would always finish up by saying, and do I love you even when you get in trouble? Or do I love you even when you disobey me? Yes, you love me even when I'm bad, you love me. Always, always, always. I'll always love you. Right? And that grew out of this awareness that little obsessive compulsive, both my wife and I were fairly rigorous in terms of the discipline. We had clear expectations, and you got rewarded when you did good stuff, and you got in trouble when you did bad stuff. But we recognize that without the warmth and the intimacy tends to raise a person who's fairly cold, and although not genuinely empty on the inside, right? All that stuff is still in there. They're isolated from it, isolation of affect, right? It's like it becomes disconnected. So you need to balance it with the warmth and the affection. You got to recognize you still, even with warmth and intimacy and love and gentleness, you still produce that way of raising a child still does tend to produce some degree of obsessive compulsiveness, or another way of saying that is orderliness and meticulousness and conscientiousness. Not necessarily a bad thing, right? Again, there's healthy expression of these things and unhealthy expression of these things. So, balanced with love and affection, and gentleness and kindness and all those kind of warm fuzzies, things can go well. If on the other hand, what you get is this kind of rigid, controlling, rigorous discipline style and expectations in the absence of affection, or when the expectations are developmentally unrealistic, the kid can't meet the expectations, then you set the kid up to become essentially afraid of their own id, of their own animal self, right? Afraid of their own impulses, and they become more rigid and almost frantic to control them. And you can see how when the animalistic impulses and the messiness of emotion and all that kind of stuff becomes more frightening because it's more unacceptable in that household, the child is more likely to disavow it entirely and try to hide from themselves that that's any part of what they actually are. And they become very, very focused on controlling themselves intrapsychically and controlling themselves interpersonally, not allowing any of the messiness out, even to the extent of denying to themselves that the messiness even exists. As we're talking about this distinction between healthy and unhealthy upbringings that produce obsessive compulsive character, healthy and unhealthy outcomes, one of the characteristics that you see is in people who are obsessive compulsive and are less healthy, you tend to see them motivated by shame. Their efforts to control themselves are driven by a fear of being caught, a fear of being discovered, a fear of being seen, perceived negatively, as opposed to the person who exerts control and pursues orderliness and cleanliness and those kinds of things, because they will feel bad even if nobody else sees it. That they'll feel inadequate or as if they could. I'm not living up to what I could do. That would be the obsessive compulsive mindset. I can do better than this, and I feel bad because I'm not fulfilling my potential. That's the world in which the obsessive compulsive lives. More healthy, it's guilt, it's internal. Less healthy, it's shame, it's external. And as you get somebody who is more shame-based, they tend to be more negativistic. They tend to be more avoidant. Not, I want to fulfill my potential, but I don't want to mess up. And they tend to be more kind of indignant and easily irritated by the perceived failings of those around them, their own failings, but also the people around them. As you get healthier on the obsessive compulsive kind of continuum, where the people who they're more internally driven, their urge to be controlled, orderly, etc., is more about fulfilling potential and tends to be more driven by guilt. They're still likely to struggle with a tendency towards judgment of people around them, but there's a little more capacity for empathy, probably because they likely received the empathy when they were young and they failed, right? Okay, sense of self. This stuff at this point probably comes as no surprise. The sense of self-esteem tends to be built around the capacity to manage one's own id. How effectively do you control impulsiveness, messy emotion, these kinds of things. The better managed these kinds of things are, the better one feels about themselves. The more reinforced one's esteem is with by the voices of the superego, the input of the superego. And bear in mind that the nature of the control of the impulses is indicative of relative health, right? So somebody where the control is rigid and they're not allowed to be aware of, to their conscious experience, they don't have those messy emotional reactions, and they don't have insight into why they feel that certain things have to be done in a certain way, and that their house has to be neat and orderly and clean. There's no capacity for understanding where this is coming from. There's no tolerance for failure, or there's minimal tolerance for failure. And when failure is experienced, intense shame is experienced. Relatively rigid, relatively less healthy. Healthier, you get more tolerance for, there may be an awareness, okay, I'm not real comfortable crying in front of people. but there's an acceptance that, this is part of being human. And in the very healthy end of it, an actual effort to begin to integrate some of the kind of walled off aspects of the id into one's identity. An effort to develop some acceptance of some of the chaotic nature, so to speak, of our animal selves. So regardless of the relative health or lack of health, people who are obsessive compulsive tend more toward religiosity, not inevitably, but you're a little more likely to find them espousing religious beliefs. They, surprise, surprise, they tend to be hardworking, conscientious, self-critical, because they are pursuing perfection. They want to do things just exactly right. Part of conscientiousness is being dependable. They tend to be people that they tend to be people that you want to work with because they do their job. Might be kind of hard to work for because their expectations are very high. Great person to have be your employee. If anything, you might say, hey, okay, it's you're doing fine. Take a breath, settle down a little bit, because they're going to be pushing and pushing and pushing to do the best job they can for you. Interestingly, this is one of the other points of departure between the person who is predominantly obsessive as opposed to a person who's predominantly compulsive. People who are predominantly obsessive will tend to struggle with procrastination, and this is basically because they're immersed in that the perfect is the enemy of good dilemma, right? They want so badly to do things perfectly that they're immobilized. They can't choose because they're looking for something more perfect. And sometimes this actually takes on the flavor of self-sabotage. And of course, the result of that is, shame and embarrassment and frustration with themselves and resentment and etc. So the person who tends to be more obsessional can really struggle with procrastination, indecisiveness. Conversely, the person who tends more toward compulsivity may find themselves kind of impulsively selecting a behavior and doing it. And kind of like the establishing an automatic response to the situation which is implemented without thought. I mean, that's compulsion, right? You just do it. You don't think about it. It doesn't matter whether it's reasonable. This situation, this is what I do. And sometimes that can look, and I guess in a way it's impulsive. Technically no, but I can kind of see how it would look impulsive. It's not so much impulsive as it is ritualized. It's planned and organized well in advance, and is implemented with minimal regard for the circumstances. Once a certain criteria is met, this is the circumstance. In these circumstances, this is what I do. And you can get, in an obsessive compulsive person, you can get a combination of these things, right? You can get somebody who frequently procrastinates, except around things where they've got the built-in ritualized behavior that they can implement without having to problem solve. Last couple things. Again, this is all, at this point, this should all make total sense to you. People who are obsessive compulsive tend to be they loathe anything that reeks of poor self-control, especially emotional aspects of lack of self-control. They like to see themselves as disciplined, orderly, reliable, and if you're thinking, wow, these are pretty good attributes, yeah, they are. This is part of, if you, again, it might be difficult to be in a relationship with somebody who is obsessive compulsive because of that some degree of rigidity, some degree of, especially at the less healthy end, less comfort with emotional intimacy and vulnerability. On the other hand, they're likely to be loyal to you. They're going to be dependable. They're going to be consistent across situations. You're not going to have to wonder what you're going to get. They tend to be pretty honest people. When they decide they're going to do something, they tend to do it. So they tend to be reliable breadwinners, good homemakers. They aren't spontaneous people. They don't tend to be adventure seekers. These are the people that when they go on vacation, they are tourists. They want to know what their schedule is going to be. They want it to be reliable. They want it to be predictable. They're the people who will go overseas to Italy and decide that what they want is McDonald's that day, right? They're not the people that are strolling the back alleys in Rome looking for that cool little out of the way Italian place where nobody speaks English, right? They're not. That's not where their strength lies. And then the last thing I'll mention about them is that one of the things that you see for people who are obsessive compulsive is they take almost a kind of a perverse pleasure in how hard it is to be them. And in that, if that sounds a little bit like masochism, it is kind of like masochism. Right? Masochism is they take some pride in how much they are willing to suffer for their love, right? Or how much they're willing to suffer to do the right thing, sort of a thing. The obsessive compulsive is proud of how much, how hard it is to be this damned good, right? How hard it is to be this disciplined and reliable and frankly compulsive about things. So again, I say this at the end of every lecture about each of these personality characteristics. There's so much you could say about them. I'm going to cut it short because I'm sure I'm driving you crazy. It's already been an hour and 10 minutes. All right, so I will close that out there for the obsessive compulsive personality structure.